Well, I cannot thank you enough for doing this podcast with me today.
Hello, welcome to the Geri Academy podcast with your host, geriatrician Dr. Golnur Sharif Saleh, providing you with information on aging-related topics. Learn more at geriacademy.com and follow me on social media.
Hello, welcome to the Geri Academy podcast with your host, Dr. Golnur Sharif Saleh. Today, we're going to talk to Jan Stephanides. She is an occupational therapist who specializes in driving. Hello, Jan.
Good morning.
How are you?
I am great. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here because this is such an important topic. Jan, tell me a little bit about what you do.
I am an occupational therapist and I run the driving program at Blue Ridge Healthcare. 14 and a half and older that might be candidates for driving. We do a bioptic driving assessment, which is in North Carolina. If you have vision of 20/200, you can legally drive using a telescope that's mounted to your glasses, but you have to have specialized training to learn how to drive with those. We also do equipment modifications, assessments for equipment, hand controls, left foot accelerators, and I have a vehicle that have hand controls put in on the right side or the left side, and you can learn how to drive that way.
Tell me how you got into this line of work.
I've been an occupational therapist for more than 30 years. And about 10 years ago, I read an article about occupational therapists helping someone who was paralyzed be able to drive with hand controls. And so I did some investigating and I took a job with a company in Greensboro that trained me how to do driving evaluations with equipment modifications. I have a national certification, which is a certified driving rehabilitation specialist. To be able to sit for the examination, you have to have 1,500 hours of experience working with driving rehab specialists. So once I got the hours that I needed, then I sat for a national exam. There are 350 of us CDRSs in the United States and Canada.
Wow. So I feel pretty lucky that...
And it is a credentialing body that most the Department of Motor Vehicles requires a CDRS to make recommendations for driving restrictions.
Out of the entire United States and Canada, that we have you, right, in our small town in Morganton, North Carolina. Like, that is pretty lucky. So we sometimes send patients for you to evaluate. And my patients are generally those who have some memory issues, we call it cognitive impairment, dementia, and family members are concerned about their driving abilities. Can you tell me a little bit, just before we get into the memory issues, at what point should an older adult maybe consider to stop driving?
It's not about age. Driving is about your ability. So there's not a specific age that somebody needs to think about retiring from driving. But just like our jobs, we all plan to retire. So it's important that we think about when we are going to retire from driving. So it's a good conversation to have.
Can you give me some statistics on maybe older drivers and why it might be a safe option to at some point consider stopping to drive?
If you are driving, you have an increased life expectancy. But we have to take in consideration, I want my clients to be independent, but I also have to think about public safety. And safety always comes first. Adults 65 and over, 90% of the time, they are either a passenger or a driver. So by not driving, it can drastically affect somebody's life. Older drivers do not cause more accidents, but they have a higher fatality rate when involved in a crash. In other words, they are less likely to survive. So we really need for people that potentially could cause an accident to stop driving when the criteria is recognized that they should stop.
Sometimes in my clinic, I have patients that actually come to me, and when I'm evaluating, I always ask, are you driving? And they tell me, like, oh, yes, I'm still driving. And I ask them about any accidents or any issues with driving. But occasionally I get the patient who says, I stopped driving a few years ago because I was worried I was going to cause an accident. That's kind of cool because then I don't have to think about that. But what I end up with is the patient that says, I'm still driving. Then sometimes their adult children are in the room and they are terrified that their loved one is driving. They'll call me later on and say, we don't think it's safe for mom to drive. She has bumped the car here and there. So can you tell me what some of the risk factors are for maybe even just adult children to consider helping their parents to maybe think like, okay, maybe it's time?
So some of the red flags are, if adult children have concerns, you should let your physician know that you have concerns about it. Acute events suddenly could potentially cause driving concerns. Changes in their medical history could cause driving concerns. Big change in the medications that they're taking, that can affect driving. And particularly vision changes or changes in their physical ability can affect driving.
So can you tell me about some of the age-related changes that occur with your vision that can impair driving?
So our older drivers really have to think about potential issues like macular degeneration or glaucoma or cataracts. As we age, our ability to see in low light decreases. So some of the tips that I recommend is that you have your eyes checked on a regular basis. And maybe you need to think about considering not driving at night, letting somebody else do that driving for you.
How about physical changes?
So, as we age, our strength and our flexibility and our reflexes all change. One of the critical things that can happen is neuropathy. That's the loss of sensation in your feet or your hands. If you take your shoes and socks off and you cannot feel the bottom of your feet, you should not be using those limbs for driving. The very, very, very best thing that our older clients can do to help with their physical ability is exercise. And that means walking. Just get out and walk. That is the very best thing that you can do to maintain your physical ability to provide, to have safe driving.
I'll be honest, I hear this a lot of times. I'll ask my patients about neuropathy, so numbness and loss of sensation in their feet. And I'll ask them, are you driving? And they'll say, oh, yes, I'm driving. And sometimes I've also heard some of my patients tell me, I have to lift my right leg and put it on the brake and move it to the gas. And that's pretty frightening, right? Because if you have to make a sudden decision and you don't have time to move that limb, then that poses such a big danger to the road and potentially could harm you and somebody else, right?
And I tell people, do you want to spend the end of your life dealing with the knowledge that you accidentally killed somebody? It's not worth it. And oftentimes, especially our healthy older adults can learn to drive with hand controls if it's their feet that are not working. So there are a lot of options out there. But I do want to point out that if people are using an orthotic on their foot that covers the bottom of it, I wouldn't recommend that they drive with a foot that has an AFO on the bottom of it. They also shouldn't be driving if they have a prosthesis on that limb, because that can drastically affect your ability to tell if your foot is on the gas or the brake.
Wow, I guess those were things I didn't even think about. How about cognitive abilities?
So again, as we age, we tend to have maybe memory issues or slowness of processing. But to be able to drive, you have to make quick decisions. You have to switch your attention quickly. You have to be able to divide your attention. So for example, driving feels very rote to us because we've been doing it for so many years. But think about it. You have to be able to pay attention to that speed limit sign, which is far vision, quickly shift to near vision to be able to see your speedometer, and you still have to keep the car on the road and respond. That is an example of switching attention quickly and efficiently. And you got to remember that driving is the most complex activity of daily living that we do. Your brain has to be firing as quickly and efficiently as possible. And if it doesn't, then maybe driving could be impaired.
What about your evaluation? How do you start an evaluation and what is the process?
So for a driving evaluation, people come to me sometimes because the DMV in Raleigh has referred them to have an occupational therapy evaluation. Sometimes people come to me because they have concerns about their driving. And sometimes a physician has referred them to me. And the key thing that I want to say is I hate to have to tell somebody that they can't drive. I'm going to work hard to make it so that they can continue to drive safely. But when someone comes to me, I kind of break it down into a visual assessment, a cognitive assessment, and a physical assessment. And we look at those three areas and determine if you have what it takes. The testing that I do is all backed by research. The research indicates if a certain standard is recommended for driving privileges.
How do you start your test? What happens with the physical testing?
So I'm going to have the client come in and I'm going to make sure that their arms work well enough to handle the steering wheel. If I have a one-armed driver, then I might recommend a spinner knob so that they can safely turn the wheel only using one hand. We look at sensation, proprioception, the ability to be able to let go of the steering wheel and reach their hand over to the turn signal without having to use their eyes. I take their shoes and socks off and I test the sensation on the bottom of their feet. And generally, if they don't feel on the bottom of their feet, I'm not going to pass them to be able to drive with their feet, but we might consider using hand controls if they're open to that idea. So that would be the physical assessment. I also do a mobility assessment. There is research that says, if you can walk 10 feet and turn around and come back and sit down under 9 seconds, your risk of having a crash is no higher than the average person. But if it takes you more than 9 seconds, you are 3 times more likely to be at an at-fault crash based on the research. And again, if somebody can't do that, that does not mean they don't drive. But that's a red flag to me that if we do a behind-the-wheel driving assessment, we're going to see if their limited mobility affects their ability to handle the vehicle. For example, I might say, there's a Walmart. Find the Walmart and park the car. The multitude of things that can happen in a parking lot at a Walmart is going to challenge the person's ability to make decisions while they're driving. I also give them a task where I want them to call out the speed limit signs on the side of the road and then look at their speedometer. And I'm keeping track of how many speed limit signs they call out and how many we pass. I recommend that people see about 75% of them. So I'm keeping track. And if oftentimes people who have cognitive deficits often drive in what's called a tunnel vision approach. They can really only look at the road ahead of them and they cannot visually scan because they are so focused on the road ahead. And that is not a safe driver because they cannot respond quickly to the obstacles that are in their path. There's a lot of things that happen in the car based on what happens in the in-clinic testing.
One of the things that I had noticed when you say they have this tunnel vision is when I do see patients and I'm evaluating them in the memory clinic for dementia, when we are doing some testing where they're drawing, they're looking at things in space and they're not seeing everything. And that kind of cues me, like it worries me. Oh my gosh, this person probably needs an evaluation for driving. And what's interesting is a lot of times our patients who have memory challenges are in denial and they don't want to drive. And sometimes I'll ask the adult children, and I'll ask them to, hey, maybe you need to address this with your parent. And they're terrified. They're terrified to bring it up. What would you say to that?
So a lot of times I recommend you can use me as the bad guy. It is often difficult for adult children to be the ones to take away the keys. Also, I recommend that physicians would refer because, again, the physician and the client can maintain that relationship. I'm going to see them for a one-time visit, and I can be the bad guy. I do think whether we decide about driving continuing or driving retirement, it's a good evaluation because you learn a lot about your parent and ways to strengthen their weaknesses and to prolong their quality of life based on the testing results that we do.
I had a patient actually whose children did not want to drive. And I really wasn't that worried, So we sent this patient to a driving program because this patient was going to drive. And the children were still so worried. Well, came back and was like, oh, the driving evaluator said, I can drive. And so, I think that can happen too, right? Sometimes your adult children are worried, but then they can have the reassurance that, oh no, mom and dad are actually doing okay and they're safe on the road.
Right. So The good thing about a certified driving rehabilitation specialist is that we have the option to put restrictions on the driver's license if we find that they did okay driving in town, driving to their local place, driving to their grocery store, driving to their hair salon, but they could not get up enough speed to enter the interstate. They had more difficulties when they were driving faster. Again, that's processing speed. So by slowing them down and limiting where they can drive, we can keep people safe and driving longer by adding restrictions. So I do have the option of no interstate, nothing over 45. I can do 5 miles from home. I can do 5 different places. We have a lot of options as far as allowing someone to be able to continue to drive in a safe way.
How about the vision part of your assessment?
In North Carolina, you need to have vision of 20/70 at least to be able to drive. So if you have 20/70, you've got restrictions already. I do recommend that you get your vision, that children have their parents' vision assessed yearly. I do 90% of the decisions that a person makes when they are driving is based on what they see and how quickly they can process that visual information. So I do spend a lot of time on visual acuity, visual fields, and visual perceptual skills. And all that testing is using some machines that I have in my office and pencil and paper tasks.
Now, if someone wanted to come for an evaluation, or an adult child wanted their parent to have an evaluation, or even an adult, right, who may have some physical issues and they might need some assistance with driving better because neck issues or limb issues, do they need to have a referral to see you, or can they just call in?
So to have a driving evaluation, you do not have to have a physician's referral, but I am going to ask you who your physician is, because if we do make any recommendations, the physician is the gatekeeper. They are the ultimate decision maker. So I'm going to send a copy of my report to the physician. Oftentimes, you need a referral for your insurance to pay for the evaluation. Unfortunately, driving is considered a privilege, not a necessity. So insurance does not cover the driving evaluation. So it is an out-of-pocket expense.
Okay. How much are people generally spending on these driving evaluations?
So when you come to me, it's $250 for the first part of the testing. If we decide to get in the car and drive, it's another $250. So the evaluation is $500, and you're usually with me for 2.5 hours.
Okay. That's pretty extensive, though.
Yes, yeah. And I do think it's a good, many programs have a lump fee whether you drive or not. I think it's nice if you are in there and you recognize you are below average on several areas that you can choose. Okay, I agree. I recognize that I've slowed down. I recognize that I have anxiety when I drive. I recognize that cars are honking at me. Maybe it is time for me to think about retiring from driving. And of course, if someone comes to me and I recommend retirement from driving, I'm going to talk to you about, okay, what does this look like? I'm going to give you transportation options. I'm going to give you resources. We're going to figure it out together. Because as an OT, I want you to be independent. And just because you don't drive does not mean that you stop living. So we're going to talk about all those things too.
I think there are a lot of people that just don't drive. But that thought that, oh, now I'm going to not drive, that's a big deal. For a lot of people, right? I mean, it would be hard for me to think, how will I get around? How will I just function in this world without the ability to drive? Tell me a little bit about retiring from driving.
If you want to talk to your parent about considering retiring from driving, it is best that you start that conversation before there is a crisis. So I make recommendations like asking a question. Hey, Mom, have you ever thought about what you're going to do when you stop driving? How do you think we should go about you getting your groceries? Or how are we going to get you to the grocery store? And it's a non-threatening way to get your parent to start thinking about life without driving. Some other options is to consider a driving contract. And that's when the adult children and the parent sit down and talk. Are you in agreement when we decide it is time to stop driving that you're going to agree with us? And that way can give you peace of mind. If you recognize something that maybe it's time to stop driving, that you know your parent is going to voluntarily stop driving. Another thing to think about is, who is the person in the family that should start the conversation? 75% of the time, it should be the spouse. But sometimes if there's not a spouse or there's some contention between the couple, then maybe an adult child, sometimes the pastor, or sometimes a close friend. So you have to think about who should bring that conversation, who should start that conversation. Some of the things to think about is that there are alternative transportation options. Most people can get a list of transportation options from the Council on Aging in their town. Because we are in a small town, we don't have quite as many options as some of the other bigger cities do, but there usually are really great options with family and friends and churches.
So talk a little bit about beginning that transition to stop driving.
So some things that you can do for your parent is to start talking about limiting driving. So you might get them to agree to only drive in their town. If they're going to go out of town, then they get someone else to drive them. They start using public transportation before they really need it. Because if people are used to getting on the bus, even while they're still driving, once they stop driving, the bus will seem like no big deal. Start asking for neighbors and relatives to assist with helping them.
Is there a way, like I know how to get a hold of you and I know how to refer my patients to you. We're in the same healthcare system. But what about other people, like maybe other listeners who are in other parts of the states and they really want someone to evaluate their driving? Where could they find that resource?
So you can always go online, and the Association of Driving Rehab Specialists, which is called ADED.com, you can go to that website and type in your zip code, and it will list the driving evaluators that are near you. But if you are in this area, you can just go to Carolina's Healthcare and type in driving evaluator, and our name and number will come up. We are in the outpatient clinic, and you can just do physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy outpatient clinic, and they can get an appointment there.
And then always you can ask your primary care provider, right, to put in a
request.
referral, because it doesn't have to be a memory doctor that does that.
That's right. Anybody can.
Okay, excellent. Yep. What other things do you want to tell me today that you think I maybe missed asking you?
Some things about the driving evaluation. We follow all the COVID protocols. So the car windows are down when we're in the car. We sanitize between each patient. It's all leather interior, so everything's cleaned in between clients. And of course, you have to wear a mask and glasses, and you clean your hands before. I am a certified driving instructor, which means through the state of North Carolina, I'm allowed to get in the car with people who don't have a driver's license, new drivers. And we have a vehicle that's equipped with an instructor's brake and, of course, all kinds of adaptive equipment.
I have a few more questions specifically about patients who have dementia and driving. Like maybe if you could give us some warning signs or just some recommendations when we have patients with dementia.
Memory issues and driving typically do not go together. There's a research article that was written in 2010, and they did a literature review based on people who had gotten lost. They used police reports and newspaper articles. And they went through all of those, and they found out that on an average, about half of those people were lost anywhere from 1 to 10 days to be found. Some of those people, I think a quarter of those people were found dead, and they were anywhere from 1 to 1,000 miles away from home. Driving and memory loss do not go together, and mainly because clients with dementia or Alzheimer's often don't recognize that they have issues with driving. They stop to ask directions, but they can't remember what those directions were. The research says newly diagnoses of dementia possibly can drive. It is recommended that an on-the-road assessment is the best predictor for driving ability. And so if your loved one has a diagnosis of dementia, you should have a driving evaluation with an on-the-road assessment. There's research out there that talks about memory issues and driving. And basically, if your memory is impaired, you should not drive, period. If it's moderate to severe dementia, the research says you absolutely should not drive, period. If I have a client with a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's, my best practices recommends that if I do a driving evaluation, they must come back for another on-the-road test within 6 months, especially if there are cognitive changes since the last evaluation. So if you do come to see me, I'm going to work hard to make it so that you can continue to drive, but you do have to come back for another test just because it's a progressive disease, and often driving is one of the first things that deteriorates. Some of the warning signs for people who might benefit from having a driving evaluation is if suddenly you have anxiety about driving. If it feels like the traffic is going a lot faster around you, that means that maybe your processing speed has slowed a little bit. Another big red flag, and this is one of the questions that I ask in my evaluation, are there unexplained dents, bumps, or scrapes on the car that you don't know how they got there? Oftentimes, it's because you have bumped into something and you're not even aware that you did it. Has your family member called you because they are lost and they can't figure out how to get home? That is a huge red flag. Another issue is, do you have family members or neighbors calling you to say, I'm worried about your mom's driving? Have you had a motor vehicle accident recently, or have you had traffic tickets or fines recently? Those are some of the big red flags that indicate that there might be some issues with someone's driving.
What I was surprised, I didn't know that statistic, that up to a quarter of those patients were found dead.
Yes.
That's significant.
It's significant.
I mean, that is significant.
So I give that article out to all my residents. I think I put it in your packet for you. It's done in 2010, which is old, but it was strictly a literature review of people who had gotten lost. And most of those were all diagnosed with mild dementia, not severe. It was mild dementia.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so that's why driving and memory loss do not go together. And like I said, you fail my memory test, that doesn't necessarily mean, but if there are deficits in your physical ability and there are deficits in your visual perceptual skills, then I might sort of suggest let's not drive. But I do give you the option. Prove to me that your memory does not affect your ability to safely operate this motor vehicle. And if I have a good driving test, then you can continue to drive. But the goal is to keep you independent, but the community safe.
Okay. Now, I'm sure like every state has their own regulation. And I know in North Carolina, the physicians can fill out a form.
Mm-hmm.
Children can fill out the same forms, right, online. What's the deal with all that?
Okay, so if you go to ncdot.gov
Mm-hmm.
and type in the search bar medical review, and then under medical review, you can go to forms, and there is a reevaluation form that anyone can fill out, and it can't be based on age. It has to be a medical diagnosis. So if there are vision changes, then you would mark visual concerns and you send it to DMV, and you have to sign it. It can't be unsigned.
And this is for doctors or
it can
children?
Be anybody.
Okay.
But physicians can also do it. And of course, what happens then is that the DMV medical will send paperwork to the client that they have to get their physician to fill out. And that's that 9-page form that I'm sure you have gotten. That
Mm-hmm.
is, are there issues of close calls? Meaning, gosh, I almost hit somebody today. I didn't even see them. Take some time to fill out. But again, it's a good way to get an objective. The physician's job is not to determine fitness to drive. It's to make a referral to the DMV, and then the medical review board really makes the ultimate decision about driving fitness based on the reports that you send in.
Wow. This has been so enlightening. I mean, I know you and I have spoken, but just so much more information that I'm really thankful that you did this. And I really hope that our listeners benefit from this point. Dementia is the 6th leading cause of death as our population ages, as our baby boomers age, again, I totally agree with you. Age shouldn't be prohibitive, but some of the other medical conditions like dementia that come up as we age, then, we may need to reconsider transportation, driving, not to just keep ourselves safe, but other people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's great to have services that can tell you, okay, you're okay. Just let's do these things to keep you safer. But we want you to be on the road as long as possible. But we also want to have a mechanism that if you are not safe, we need to get you off the road. And if you have concerns, come have an evaluation and we'll help you figure out that process together.
Jan, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your wisdom with us today. I hope that our listeners have better understanding of aging and driving safely. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Jerry Academy podcast. Learn more at jerryacademy.com or follow me on social media for information on future episodes.